welcome to the profile. I'm so excited to have you.
It's good to be with you.
Awesome. So before this interview, I talked with somebody who knows you well, and they and they told me something really interesting that I don't hear too often, which is that you don't fit neatly into any stereotype. And with the profile, I talk a lot about the most successful people being able to hold a multitude of identities and not just identifying one specific way. So if I asked you, who is Heather Wilson, how would you respond?
Well, first of all, I think that's an insightful comment about me, and I often I think more people than you might think are Rubik's cubes, right? They have different colors on depending on how people see them and what angle they're looking at them from. So I think that's probably a good description of me, but I wouldn't say it's all that unique. But I would say that I'm an academic with a non-academic work history. I'm a public servant. I'm a wife and a mother and a grandmother now. And I'm a learner that thinks strategically. So you're right. I think I probably have different friendships and relationships where people see me based on our connection. But there are other aspects to me as well. So, but I'm probably not unique that way.
I love that. I love the learner identity. That's how I define myself as well. So we're not going to get too much into your CV, although I checked it out and it is 10 pages long. That is incredible.
It's short academic terms, so don't.
That's great. So you were the first female veteran elected to a full term in Congress. Can you tell me a little bit about your military background and how that colored and influenced your approach to serving in the House of Representatives?
I think, first of all, I've been called to service in a variety of ways in different times in my life. And certainly the first one was to go to the Air Force Academy. My family had a legacy of service. My father and my grandfather were both aviators. They both served in the military. And my mother was a nurse. And so I told somebody once that, I cannot remember what political party my parents were registered. I have no idea to this day. But I do know that if you were watching the Memorial Day parade and you didn't get your rear end up off the curb when the flag went by, you were going to get hauled up by the scruff of your neck. They love this country and they served. And that was expected of us as well. And so when they opened the Air Force Academy to women, that seemed a little bit different to me. And I was a kid that needed a challenge, and also a full ride scholarship to college was kind of a big deal too. But it was a life-changing choice for me. And I really enjoyed my service in the military in ways that perhaps I didn't anticipate when I was 17 years old. But I think how it influenced my service in the Congress, there had been no women veterans there. There were very few. The number of veterans was declining at that time because, of course, the Korea and Vietnam and World War II veterans were gradually kind of leaving. And so that perspective of having served, I think, was helpful. But honestly, there weren't that many PhDs in the Congress, and certainly not PhDs in international relations. So my service on the Armed Services Committee and on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence were both, I think, really important parts of my service.
Yeah, so it's almost like the intersection of all these different experiences coming together.
Yeah, and there were times that having been a woman in the military also gave me a perspective and an ability to talk about some issues that some of my colleagues just didn't have that background.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because when I was researching your story, I thought about myself in the sense that the profile, if you've been reading it for a while, it's all about perspective. And I love people who have a different perspective and people who you cannot put in a box. So, for example, I was born in Bulgaria, but my family moved to Atlanta, Georgia when I was 8. And then from there, I moved to New York when I was an adult. And it's just like seeing those three completely different petri dishes of, culture gave me a perspective that very few other people have. So I'm able to empathize with people politically or non-politically on different aspects of the spectrum because I've been through that.
I think actually you're right, but it's also really important. It's given me different perspectives as a leader. And I think it's helped me tremendously to be a better university leader, but also, leadership on corporate boards or in associations, and certainly in the Secretary of the Air Force and other things. And it's so I have a variety of, a lot of people have much more linear and sane career trajectories, but mine has had different chapters, and I draw experience from all of those things. It's almost as though I tell students this sometimes. So my dad was a mechanic in addition to being a pilot. And we lived at the end of this kind of the last house on the road in a very small community in New Hampshire. And it was back when they had traveling salesmen. You probably, you're too young to remember this, but the traveling salesman would come around from the Snap-on tools guy. I don't know if my dad died when I was young, but I still remember this truck because it was red like the toolbox, the Snap-on toolbox. And he would come maybe every 6 weeks or something, and my dad would go out there and they'd lean against the truck, and it was like Christmas. Do not interrupt Dad when the Snap-on tool guy is there, right? And he'd talk to him and laugh with him for a while, and then he'd, pull his wallet out of the back of his pocket, and he'd buy a tool. And the guy'd open up the back of his truck and sell a tool to my dad, and my dad would take it into the garage where he worked on his car and had all his toolboxes for his airplanes and things. And the thing that I remember was not only the truck, but my dad usually didn't use that tool that day. He didn't buy something immediately when he needed it, but he had a toolbox and he collected tools. And to me, some of my experiences in life and professionally have given me tools in my box. And there have been times when I needed them that years later that I didn't expect. So I advise our students to collect tools.
That's such a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Because you may need it in the future. You just don't know in what situation. Absolutely.
Just don't know. And one of the things that, we just went through a global pandemic shortly after I arrived here at the university. And of course, none of us knew what we were doing. Nobody did. But everybody swarmed this problem, brought with them their life experience and the tools in their boxes to get after a really difficult problem. And it was it's kind of interesting. I've dealt with different kinds of crises in my career, and most recently as Secretary of the Air Force. But a friend or a colleague of someone who works with the Chancellor called me about 3 or 4 weeks after we had, taken an entire university and turned it into virtual learning and set up testing and did all of these things. She was kind of laughing, and she said, "I just want to let you know that of all his presidents, the Chancellor, you're the one the Chancellor is not worried about."
You have a hefty toolbox.
Okay, I think, but we're still making up out here. And I had only been here, 4 or 5 months or something like that. But I had a variety of life experiences that allowed me to pull people together and figure out who's got what in their truck and bring tools to the problem.
Yeah. And I want to touch on that experience a little bit. So you served as the Secretary of the Air Force from 2017 to 2019. And that means that you oversaw the Air Force's annual budget, which I looked up, and it's more than $138 billion. That's a number that most people can't even fathom. So my question is, I used to take
zeros off the end just so I could get it in my head. It was completely unreal.
It's insane. So how did you gain the skills or the tools to know how to manage that sort of budget? And what were some of the challenges in deciding how to allocate capital?
Well, first of all, I don't think anyone prepares for something fully that scale, and you don't have to do it alone. There are processes and procedures within the Defense Department that are set up that you then kind of slot yourself into. Some of those procedures aren't very good, and the Chief of Staff and I at the time didn't want to be boxed in by major strategic decisions that are being made through a machine in the Pentagon. And then when it gets right down to it, they come and they brief you with 150 slides and say, here's the 1% you can change. So we actually changed some of the processes to make sure that the strategic guidance was included very early on. And I spent a lot more time on the budget than I ever thought I was going to. And of course, the budget is the way you influence policy. And I spent a lot more time on it and getting it through the Congress. So you're working, you're executing 1 year's budget. You are advocating for the next year's budget on Capitol Hill. You're preparing the budget for the 1 year out to get it through the Office of Management and Budget and getting it up to the Hill. And then in the Pentagon, you also have 5 and 15-year looks where you're looking out at what the major financial issues are going to be in the long term. So I spent a lot of time on the budget, far more than I expected to have to do.
And you mentioned that, you've learned a lot from managing and navigating crises. What's one sort of crisis that you navigated as the Secretary of the Air Force? And what did you learn from it?
Sure, a couple of them. Just, we had a major hurricane that completely destroyed Tyndall Air Force Base. And was probably a $5 billion problem to fix. So certainly another one was the shooting in the church in Texas. And maybe I'll talk about that one, but you may recall it. And someone who was a former airman went into a church in Texas on a Sunday morning and opened fire and killed a lot of people. And that Sunday afternoon, I got a phone call from our Inspector General. Because of course this was on the news, and the first thing he said was, "We think it was an airman."
Wow.
And then he called back and said, "We're not sure, but we think that he was discharged and had mental health issues, as well as was investigated for some felony things while he was in the Air Force, and we won't know until tomorrow morning when we can open everything up." So we arranged to meet that next morning with the Chief of Staff and everybody, all the senior people involved in this. What we were told then was that the Air Force, not only had he been an airman and been discharged, but that under the law, the Air Force should have notified the law enforcement and put him on the list that would have prohibited him from purchasing a weapon.
Wow.
And we failed to do it.
So how did you handle that as a leader?
Yeah. So how do you handle this? And the Chief of Staff and I were there, and we kind of went around the table. We discussed it all. It was interesting. The lawyer, he wasn't the full general counsel was out of town, but it was somebody on his staff. The only person in the room that suggested, well, maybe we want to put out a statement that's, we're looking into this and we're not, kind of mitigating risk to the service. And the chief and I talked about it and said, we know what the truth is. We're much better off owning up to what we know and fixing it than trying to suggest that, well, we're further evaluating and investigating. What if we knew the truth? And we were much better off to just own up to it and fix the problem. And somebody else suggested, well, blame it on your predecessors. Like, we own this institution. We leadership this institution. We need to own up to this and fix it. And so we drafted a statement. I told them I wanted a statement by 11. They kind of got it by 1, I think. The chief and I was actually going out of town and then came back the next day, and the chief and I had a press conference and answered what we knew and what we intended to do to fix it. And then we fixed it. And then I went up to the Hill and talked to a heck of a lot of people, showed them what we thought the problem was, showed them how it happened. sworn, we not only fixed it, we went back through the records back to 2007. Some of them were in, of every airman who had been discharged,
Wow.
to make sure that the records were correct. And then we worked with the FBI on people don't do this on purpose. They've got too much work to do. They've got this to file. It's not clear what the process is. Was there a way we could fix the system so that well-meaning people would be unlikely to make that mistake again? And we worked with the FBI to do that as well. So about 6 months later, there was a congressional hearing on this issue about notification and making sure databases were up to date. And the hearing went well. My head of legislative liaison was walking out of the hearing with me that day. And he said, I learned something today. He was a 2-star general. And he was just a great guy, brilliant guy, great airman.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I learned something today. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, the result of this hearing was established in the first 24 hours after the problem happened, which is to own up to things and fix them.
Okay. Go ahead.
That's how that's absorbed a huge amount of time for several months on something that was just a terrible, awful thing.
And this is a really, really great, and thank you so much for being honest about the situation. But I have met so many CEOs of these large organizations where crisis comms advisors tell them, never admit that you made a mistake, never say sorry, try to sweep it under the table. What you did is the harder choice and the harder path. But like you said, it helps to fix the system and the underlying problem instead of just put a Band-Aid on it. But how, as a leader, how do you know when to ignore what these very high, caliber and qualified people are telling you, and when to trust, like, I need to own up to this. We made a mistake. Here's how it's going to go.
One of the things I've worked with a lot of general counsels, and they give you advice. It's one of the great things about having a good general counsel is that's one of the few privileged conversations you can have just with your lawyer. And good ones will not only tell you what the law is, but what they advise you to do, because they've seen a lot. But you always have to know the difference between the advice and the command decision. They are there to provide advice, not to decide. And that's the difference. And sometimes people are a little bit too deferential, I think, to their lawyers. And I'm married to one, so maybe that makes me willing to be not so deferential. I don't know. He was actually a JAG, and he would be the first person to probably say the same thing, that staff and lawyers advise, but there is no substitute for the decision-making by the people responsible for the outcome. And while you say it may have been the hard decision, I actually don't think it is. It may have been the harder decision in the short term, because the chief knew we were going to get grilled. We were going to get skewered the next day. But in the long term, it was the right decision. Everybody makes mistakes. The people who were involved in this didn't intentionally do this. They felt awful about it. But they don't, so stuff happens. You're there to fix problems, and I understand the causes of them and to fix them. And so I think people will forgive those who make mistakes unintentionally or where systems don't work, as long as you don't try to lie to them about it. And the chief and I were completely aligned on this. In fact, to his credit, Dave Goldfein, who still remains a very close friend of mine, he actually went out to some of the funerals in Texas. And I'm not sure I could have done that, but he did. And one of the things that was never really reported on was this was a town that was very close to San Antonio, Texas, and there were quite a few Air Force retirees who were in that congregation, and families of them. And so sometimes as a leader, it's just important to be present too.
Yeah, absolutely. So what motivated you to transition from politics to academia? And yeah, so answer that question first.
Sure. So I said, as I said, I was kind of an academic with a non-academic work history, or that the interesting thing is, until I became the president of South Dakota Mines, I never used my title. No one ever called me Dr. Wilson. And because I often felt that having a PhD distanced me from people. It was a problem. It was not an honor, I guess. And I didn't want that distance between me and the people that I served or those who I represented. But I came close to a college presidency once before, when I had been, contacted about whether I wanted to apply and I didn't. But I was after I lost the 2012 Senate race, one of my interns, I benefited from a lousy job market, I guess, at the time. I had all these wonderful interns in that race. And one of them was a young man from Texas Tech who was from New Mexico, and he had taken a semester off because he really wanted to see this campaign through. Wonderful young man. And he said, Dr. Wilson, you're really great with students. You should become a college president, and you should be on a campus. And Texas Tech is looking for a new president, and you should apply. And I said, well, Evan, I don't think Texas Tech is looking for me, but I appreciate that. And some of the other students had said the same thing. I had over 300 interns in my congressional office and tremendously enjoyed working with young people. And served on the Rhodes Scholar Selection Committees in different states, and just started thinking about it, and then started looking around, and talked to several different headhunters and things. And South Dakota Mines was not initially on my radar screen. I'm not a PhD scientist or engineer, but the more I got involved through that process, I realized it was the right place, and I have tremendously enjoyed being in higher ed.
Yeah, and so you said that you arrived, you came into your role as a college president right as the pandemic was starting
at UTEP. Yes,
at UTEP. Correct. Yeah.
I came to UTEP in August of 2019.
Got it. August 2019. Wow. So what was the most surprising thing when you first arrived, and then how did the pandemic change everything?
Certainly there's a lot of things that make UTEP different, but one of them is it is a deeply caring and warm community. I've been in cities where people are nice. I mean, there's a lot of places where people are nice, but El Paso is warm, and it's very family oriented. And very, very friendly in a very honest and sincere way. In a world where, perhaps people aren't as civil to each other as they might be, I find El Paso different that way. It is just a warm and caring community, and that extends to our campus. I think it's one of the reasons why UTEP is so successful with first-generation college students. We meet them where they are. We care about them legitimately. We try not to put barriers in the way of their success, and we help them on to what they do next. And it's one of the most successful universities in the country in meeting the needs of its students. It's really a remarkable place.
So you have been involved, obviously, in your career with the public and the private sector leadership roles. So what are some of the key differences from those two spheres, and how have you learned to navigate both?
I think each has given richness and dimension to the other. I do enjoy board service, and one of the biggest differences is, well, two huge differences. One is time scale. So most companies, if they're looking strategically or maybe out 5 years, right? That's a long time in a company's life. Publicly traded companies have to be thinking even shorter term. And timelines for a university are much longer. This university was started in 1914, and it's going to be here 100 years hence. So how do we steward the university for the long term as a public university? The second major difference is finance, right? So we are a public university. We have tuition and fees from students, but that's actually a small part of our funding. So funding comes from the state of Texas. Funding comes from research sponsors. So the way you think about how the university is financed is different than it is in serving on a board of a privately held company or a public company, where finance is a much bigger part of how you think about things. And it's honestly, I think some of the skills honed in private industry and looking at everything from break even to cash flow is something that would probably benefit a lot of people in higher ed when they're thinking about what programs they want to start and how they do their planning and how to make the numbers work.
Absolutely. I feel like after dealing with an annual budget of $138 billion, you can make the numbers work. I was thinking about this. I'm really curious to hear your take because of your perspective. But one of the great debates in society today is the value that students actually get from attending a traditional university or college. How do you, as the leader of a large university, grapple with that tension, given how much you've seen with the military and why people choose to go certain different paths? And are there any specific things you're doing in response?
I think this is probably one of the biggest issues for higher ed leaders in thinking about how to engage on this issue. And honestly, particularly people like me, because the decline in confidence in higher education is not evenly distributed across ideology. When somebody says to me, well, I'm not sure college is worth it, my next question to them is it worth it for your kids? Or are you talking about somebody else's kids? Because often when people say that, they're thinking about someone else's kids, not their own. Now, I would say that, let's say a couple of things. One is that the best way in America to a better life for you and your family is still higher education. It is some meaningful post-high school credential. 90% of the jobs created in this country since 2008 require some kind of post-high school credential. Now, I don't say a bachelor's degree. Sometimes they're associate's degrees or training, some kind of training or formal education. And so it is still the best way to a better life. No question about that. I would say also that some families that it's not evenly distributed. In other words, you have to be a good consumer of what the costs are going to be, out-of-pocket costs, and what the benefits are. And so there are some very expensive universities that are probably not worth the price. And unfortunately, I think that some of the biggest damage to higher education in the last 30 years has been done by U.S. News and World Report.
The rankings?
They rate colleges. Through 2019, they were rating colleges, including not only on their reputation among other presidents, which is a terrible measure, but also on the exclusivity of their undergraduate admissions. Now think about this for a second. If you go out to a restaurant tonight and they refuse to serve you, do you give them 5 stars?
No, absolutely not.
Why is it that we think that if this university, name one, won't admit my kids or grandkids, they must be really good?
It's the exclusivity.
It's exclusivity. It's not excellence. And there are universities now, including UTEP, Arizona State, a whole number of public universities who choose to be judged not by whom they exclude, but by whom they include in their success. That's the right measure. And the final thing I will say is that because a lot of states have been under pressure nationwide, it's not unique to any state, but over the last 20 years, state aid to education has declined. And the reason for that has to do with pressures on when Medicaid costs increase in double digits, you've got to find the revenue from somewhere. There's been declining support for public education. I actually think that that's caused higher ed to talk to families and potential students more about an individual benefit. Your life is going to be better because you get a college degree. When in fact, our lives are going to get better if we live in an educated community.
Mm,
My life is better if there's a well-trained teacher in my child's classroom.
right.
My life is better if I have to go to urgent care and there's a well-prepared nurse who's there to help me.
Hmm.
My life is better because I don't really know how to manage my retirement account, but somebody who's really good at finance does and takes care of that for me.
Hmm. The
So
specialization.
right. So I can't build the road between my house and my job. But if it's well done and well drained, I can get here even when it's raining.
Hmm.
We live better lives because we live in an educated community. An educated community benefits us all. And I think as higher education leaders, we need to do a better job of explaining that to the public at large. And the final piece, and I guess, is, it's been the decline in confidence in higher education has been largely on the center right, not the center left.
Hmm.
So those of us who were, like sometimes, I'm not sure what box people put me in these days, but I think it's up to us to make the case for higher education. And also up to us to ensure true that here in Texas we have free speech on this campus. We encourage it, and I want my students to be able to grapple with ideas they disagree with. There is nothing worse than protecting a young student from ideas they disagree with. It's like sending them to a gym where there's no weights. We want our students to grapple with difficult ideas, and because steel sharpens steel. And that's what a university should provide.
Yes, and going off of that point, when I was reading about your background, I was thinking like the type of person who can not only survive but also thrive in the military and politics and the upper echelons of academia. I feel like you need a certain degree of thick skin. So how did you learn to develop mental resilience in the most challenging times during your career?
First of all, I'm not sure how thick. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure you do.
Interesting.
But I would say that certainly humor is underrated as a coping skill. And my husband would tell you that I grew up in the home for humor impaired, and I have been in therapy with him for over 30 years. But I do think that seeing the funny things in life, or the funny side of life in higher ed or in the military or the Pentagon, and kind of making fun of oneself and the circumstances certainly helps. It helps to laugh. And I think that's probably an underrated leadership skill and coping skill. I think also I have the ability, and I'm not sure if this is one that's common in leaders or not. I deal with a lot of specialists. One of the skills I think of good strategic leaders is to have a lens that's wide angle that can also zoom in. So you get this ability to focus in on a problem of a moment with whomever you're dealing with or whatever's going on, but also to zoom back out and to see how this fits in the larger picture. And I, mostly through life experience, I think I've developed that skill, and that I'm curious about particular problems. And you, as a leader, you've got to weigh in when there's something that's critical in a particular area, but the ability then to zoom back out and not be, just get seized with every, instead of going for the jugular, go for the capillary every time, right? And that doesn't, as a strategic leader. And so that skill, I think, is important. And the final thing is I find ways to, I have interests outside of work, and I find those to be wonderful releases and an opportunity to just get away for an hour and then be back.
Are there any universal leadership qualities that you've noticed across industry?
Values-driven leaders, in my view, are the most successful.
And define that. That means that you have a very clear.
As an example, yeah, you know what the rules are, but really it's why is that rule a rule? And in this circumstance, because most things that walk into the president's office, that get to the president's office or to the secretary's office or wherever, they're not the easy issues. The easy issues will have solved. They're not the 90-10 decisions. You know, those all get solved before they get to you. It's something really difficult or high consequence, and being driven by values. Do the right thing, do it in the right way, be transparent and fair to people. It's about the mission, it's not about you. So those kinds of things, I think, characterize exceptional leaders. I think the other thing that every great leader that I've known or had an opportunity to work with, and I've been blessed that way to see a few of them, are voracious readers. I've never met somebody who I respect as a leader who doesn't have several books they're reading at the moment, or if you ask them, what have you read that's interesting recently, and it leads to a 20-minute conversation, or they've got a list for you. So I would say that they read widely, and not just in their field. And I think that's one of the transcendent characteristics across industries, across government, higher ed, corporations, national laboratories. They tend to be voracious readers.
Absolutely. I have found the same thing studying all these really exceptional people. It's they get their best ideas from books or from reading really high quality content on a daily basis. So I like asking this question of a lot of the leaders that I interview. 2 years ago, I interviewed the former CEO of General Electric, Jeff Immelt. He was heavily criticized during his time at the helm of the company, but he said something that really struck me. He said that in the face of all the chaos, whatever he was facing that day, he managed to maintain a really solid personal life. And when he said that, I was like, wait, what? Because I just assumed that everything was chaotic. And he said, that's what I assumed. And he said, there were days when hundreds of thousands of people hated me, but one person loved me, and that was enough to keep persevering into the future. So I want to ask, you've mentioned your family. Yeah, you've mentioned your family a few times. And how have you managed to keep your personal life strong, even through all the challenges that you face in your professional life?
You know, as a young woman, I probably wouldn't have said this because, you know, I was so focused on being successful professionally that I didn't want to kind of mix these things or something. But of all the decisions I've made in life, the most important one was who I decided I'd have as a roommate. It's who I married, and I married well. And there is nothing that has made my life better than that. I would also say that you know, when I was a teenager, I wasn't like you know, babysitting for the neighbors' kids. That wasn't, and to be very honest, my family life at home wasn't sometimes all that great. And leaving at 17 was a really good idea. Although I wouldn't have admitted that at the time either. Because we weren't supposed to talk about those things, but I married well, and the most joy to me, let me just put it this way. To me, success has been something that you can achieve, but joy has seemed a gift, just to revel in, and almost something that you just are thankful every day. That I have 2 great kids, and now they both married wonderful people, and I have my first grandchild, and you know, I was texting with them this morning. I mean, it's just a very close relationship and always has been. I also think they keep you humble. You know, when you might be getting a little too big for your britches. I remember when I was a member of Congress, and my son was 4.5 when I was elected, and my daughter was 18 months old. And I got my haircut changed. I've never been very good at all this stuff. And I got my haircut changed. My boy said, Joshua said, Mom, you change your haircut. And I said, yeah, do you like it? And he said, yeah, I do. And I'm thinking, oh, that's, you know, it makes me feel so good. And he said, you look like a Q-tip. I said, well, thank you, Josh. What did I used to look like? And he said, you used to look like a dandelion.
Okay. That's amazing. Yeah.
It's just, you know, I always knew, and even when I was the head of Children, Youth, and Families in New Mexico, I was a member of the cabinet. I had to spend a lot more time on the budget and in front of the legislature there on child welfare reform, and you know, every intractable social problem is in the Children, Youth, and Families department. It seems. And I'd have to go and I'd spend like unlike the federal legislature where every legislator has 5 minutes, there's no time limit in Santa
Mhm.
Fe. So if you're there for like 3 hours testifying. It's just, it can be brutal. And I would always bring, I had my notebook and all my things in front of me to testify, but I always have a picture of my kids where I could
Mm.
see. And the reason was I knew that no matter what happened in that hearing room, I was going home for supper. And
Wow.
in a hearing that I thought was going to be particularly awful, and just, you know, they just take pleasure at raking you over the coals or something. My husband drove up from Albuquerque for the hearing, and I knew that nobody in that room mattered to me as much as him. And no matter what, we were going home together. And
Why do
that
you think
mattered.
why do you think that's so powerful? It's exactly what you're saying right now. It's exactly what Jeff said. Even if there's thousands of people who hate you, as long as one person loves you, like that's okay.
Because that's so core to all of our lives. And there's nothing better than that, you know. Those intimate, close relationships, the next adventure we're going on as a family, those little things that just fill life with such joy. And
Yeah.
we actually, you know, it's one of the things that I think in some ways I bring to my work here now. One of the things when we have cabinet meetings on every Monday morning here at the university, the last thing on the agenda of every cabinet meeting is just called joys. And we just said, who has a joy to share? It's very often that it's something about family.
Interesting.
And this, you know, this week is one of my vice presidents had something on his phone that he was teaching his son to ride his bike this weekend, and he let go of it was one of the, you know, that great moment, you know, you let go of the back of the seat. And another one that has his kids are in Taekwondo, which is I'm telling him this is a really bad idea. You know, they're going to be teenagers soon, but it's very often that it's something personal about family that's about joy.
As a very new parent, I have a 1.5-year-old daughter. I realized two things: that we all kind of think that we should be chasing the extraordinary moments in life, when in reality, it's like the mundane, boring stuff that you'll actually miss in the future. And the second thing is that, like,
or the unexpected, right?
Or the unexpected, yes. And the second thing is that, like, leadership and parenting, basically what you want to do is mentor in a leadership setting or raise in a parenting setting good decision makers. Ultimately, you want to teach them to make good decisions. And I once heard somebody say, make reversible decisions quickly and irreversible ones deliberately. And it's just like, I keep that in mind so often. I'm like, my daughter can do whatever she wants as long as it's reversible. But like you said, getting married, having kids, like those are so important because oftentimes they're irreversible.
Well, and the other thing is to enjoy those. One of the great things about having kids is you get to experience the world for the first time again.
That's so
I remember
true.
I have this, you know, thing seared in your memory, but one of them is, of course, we were in a desert, right? I remember the first time my son saw a raindrop on a leaf. I mean, he was almost breathless about it. and just how magical that was. And so that it's in addition to decision making, there is the encouragement of curiosity.
Absolutely.
And how people who are curious seem to find happiness.
I love that.
There's something to that too.
I love that. What advice would you give to young people, in particular young women who, you know, maybe are interested in pursuing leadership roles, whether it's in the military or politics or other fields?
One of them is to put yourself out there. I do think women, and sometimes, you know, I deal with our first generation students here too, they don't think that they deserve a seat at the table.
Mm.
And we're having an event at our home tomorrow night. One of the things I've been encouraging our students to do is to apply for postgraduate fellowships. And when I came here, I'll tell you just this little story.
Yeah.
So obviously my life was changed by not only going to college, but earning or not earning, having been awarded a Rhodes Scholarship. And when I first came here, I asked how many students we had apply for the Fulbright, the graduate research, Rhodes, Marshall, Mitchell, all of these Goldwater. And the answer was not many. And part of the reason for that is that our students don't know about them. Or they think that those are for rich kids who go to Stanford and Harvard, and they're not. And so I said, well, let's just do an information session. Let's just get a classroom on a Wednesday night and see if there are some students who want to come by, and we'll just talk about these things. And the dean of students sent out an email, and she called me about a week before. This was the fall of 19, and said, we're still a week out, but I wanted to let you know we've had over 900 students RSVP to come to this information session.
That's awesome.
And I said, okay, let's get a bigger classroom. And so we did that. And I thought, all right, if this is the response, there is a hunger here. And we need to react to this. So we created an office of graduate fellowships, a one-person office. The woman who runs it her name is Jen Green. And during the pandemic, there was some progress on this, but this year is really the first year or the first full cycle of being completely post-pandemic. So this is a school that really hadn't, you could probably count on one hand the last 10 years, how many applicants we've had for fellowships like this. Let me give you these numbers because they're in my head from this week.
Yeah, please.
This year we've had 23 students apply for Fulbrights.
Wow.
We have 5 Fulbright scholars and 3 alternates at UTEP. We have our first 2 Goldwater scholars ever. We have our first Truman Scholar in 13 years. We have 5 National Science Foundation graduate research fellowships, which are full rides to PhDs. And I could go on if I can remember them all, but those are the ones that stick in my head. Talent is broad distributed, but opportunity is not. And one of the things I told our students when we started, talking to them and doing boot camps for them and those kind of things, was of the 32 kids who showed up in New York City who were Rhodes Scholars the year that I was selected, 31 of us thought we were the one mistake. And the other guy was a jerk. So don't rule yourself out. It's just wonderful to see. So not only the students who have earned these awards, but all of the applicants will be coming to our house tomorrow night. Because one of the things I'm going to tell them is what you don't see on my resume are the things I wasn't chosen for. You don't see the college I didn't attend. You don't see the job I didn't get. But I can tell you I missed 100% of the shots I didn't take. And
love that.
So kudos to the students who took a shot on this one, because they'll get the next one. They'll be okay.
Yeah.
So it'll be great to have them over for supper tomorrow.
That's incredible. When you were talking, I was relating to this so much because when we moved from Bulgaria, I was in 2nd grade in Bulgaria and we moved to Atlanta and I went to 4th grade because they accidentally thought I was a math genius, but actually I was failing math in Bulgaria. But here I was, a math prodigy. But it was interesting because as I was applying to colleges and all these scholarships and stuff, and I was like, my parents didn't go to school here, so we were like, I don't know. And then I would look at the stats and be like, yeah, I don't think this is for people like us. And I would rule myself out when in reality, I should have just done it. Who knows, right? But I think that's really, really great advice.
I think it's particularly true and there's some good data on this, on job applicants because there's good data because there are all these things on Indeed and job postings and things now. Most women will look at the requirements for a job posting, and if they don't meet 100% of the requirements, they won't apply. most men, or, there's an overlap in these curves, obviously, but a much larger percentage of men will look and say, I meet 60% of the requirements, I'm going to apply.
Mhm.
So for young women particularly, I encourage them to apply. There's no, so you don't meet 100% of the requirements. Anybody who's done a lot of hiring in life, and I've hired hundreds of people over my career, you get down to that point, I call it the Mr. Potato Head moment, where what you want is her glasses and his nose and, her eyes. You've got to make compromises on the skills and abilities that you need in the moment for this position.
Yeah.
So you don't have to meet 100% of the requirements.
And just applying is all upside, very little downside, if any, right? You might get rejected, but so what?
And this is the other thing about particularly young students, and I was this way too, is fear of failure and how you define failure. And I'll tell you one other funny story about my life and children. So I applied to be the president of South Dakota Mines, and I was, one of the finalists and things. They bring you to South Dakota, and I did this interview. It's the first time I'd done a job interview in a long time, and I probably had not sufficiently prepared for it. And there's 5 predictable questions, right? One of them is, describe a time when you failed at something and what you learned from that, right? I mean, pretty predictable. Well, that question came up and I couldn't think of one.
I hate when that happens.
Well, and I kind of mumbled through something, and then I go back to my hotel room that night. I call my family and I'm cracking up with my kids because I had just lost a race for the United States Senate that was one of the highest profile races in the country. But that didn't occur to me.
Because you didn't see it as a failure necessarily.
Exactly. The people get what they choose. But that wasn't failure. It was just an experience. And but still, I probably should have picked that.
That's really interesting. I have 2 final very quick questions, but you said you are a voracious reader. I would love to know, what is the book that's had the most profound effect on you?
Wow. So set aside books on the Bible or something like that. But in different books at different times in my life, I would say when I was college age, Blackberry Winter, which is now I'm going to blank on the anthropologist Margaret Mead's autobiography. And I think that was at a time when she could, there weren't a lot of women role models doing really tremendous things. And it just struck me at the time. It was a wonderful book. Recent books that just really have stuck with me. One of them is The Splendid and the Vile, which is Churchill's a biography of Churchill. But it's like, you know how the first year of the war is going to turn, or his prime ministership's going to turn out. But it was drawing from diaries from his personal assistant and from his daughter, and it was told like a novel, and how the Battle of Britain ends, but you were just drawn into these decisions made on a
personal level.
Yeah, it was wonderful, really wonderfully done. It was an Eric Larson book. So those were good. Another one, David Epstein's book Range, which you would love if you haven't read it.
Yeah,
but it would appeal to me, right?
Yeah, that's amazing.
But that was a really, really good book. And so yeah, I could go on, but different books at different times of my life.
I like that. Not only different books at different times, but I find that if you reread the same book at a different point in your life, something different sticks out.
Yes. I recently reread Red Badge of Courage by Stendhal. And so I don't have a lot of time to read fiction, so I usually go back to the classics. And during the pandemic, read. I should have prepared for this question. It was the predictable question I didn't prepare for. North Africa, immediately after the war, about a pandemic there. Why can I not think of the name of the book? I'll text it.
It's okay. Yeah, email it to me and I'll include it.
But that book in college would have meant one thing to me, but reading it during the pandemic
Right.
was profoundly different. And the same thing with Red Badge of Courage. I just found myself writing things down that hit me in a different way as a leader, having served in the military. And what was amazing is Stendhal never served, but he understood and described moments of combat and the things that it told you about oneself that were just really striking.
I love that. Great recommendations. And my final question for you is, how do you define the word success?
A lot differently than I would have than a younger version of myself would have.
How would you have defined it then versus now?
Much more tactically about achieving things. And I like succeeding at things at work and setting goals and achieving them. I always have. But for me, it's a lot less about me than it is about the mission that matters. Personally, I would say that my goals have also become broader. I want to be a good wife and mother, now grandmother. I want to make a positive contribution to the community in which I live. And I want to be a craftsman at my work and enjoy the company of other craftsmen. So I think how I would define success is different than just the kind of temporal things or the amount of money that someone's willing to pay you, or even just achieving goals that you've set for the institution that you're leading. I find satisfaction in accomplishing a mission with an organization. I find almost no satisfaction, by the way, in financial things. I have never negotiated for a salary, and I never will. It doesn't matter to me beyond a certain point. But I do like helping institutions to succeed at things that matter, and that gives me tremendous satisfaction. And I'm involved in that. We are increasing access to excellent higher education and advancing discovery of public value, positively impacting the community that we serve. I mean, what's better than that? Not much.
Wow. What a perfect way to end this. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. This was honestly an amazing interview.